Cached in his rooms were a large quantity of currency, some code tables, and a variety of drugs and poisons, from quick-acting knockout pellets capable of producing unconsciousness for varying durations of time, to deadly cyanide compounds. In his coal cellar and in a rented garage nearby was a small arsenal of rifles, revolvers, and ammunition. Weiberg even had a suitcase of highly volatile explosives. Because of air raids, this consignment had worried him considerably. But he and Jessen Schmidt had found the perfect hiding place. The explosives were now in a large safety deposit box in the vault of the Deutsche Union Bank. Weiberg's apartment had miraculously survived the air raids up to now, but he dreaded to think of the consequences if it were hit. He would be immediately exposed. Jessen Schmidt had told Weiberg that at the right time the supplies would be issued to various groups of operatives and saboteurs who would shortly arrive in Berlin. The operations of these selected agents were to begin on the receipt of a signal sent either by radio or through the courier network from London. Weiberg expected the distribution to be made soon. Jessen Schmidt had been warned to stand by for the message sometime during the next few weeks, for the work of the teams would coincide with the capture of the city. According to the information Jessen Schmidt and Weiberg had received, the British and Americans would reach Berlin around the middle of April. The 21st Army Group had been specially reinforced for the offensive, with top priority in troops, air support, supplies and equipment. Montgomery commanded almost 1 million men in about 35 divisions and attached units, including the U.S. Ninth Army. 4 days prior, Churchill had travelled with General Eisenhower to Germany to witness the opening phase of the river assault. As he stood on the banks of the Rhine, watching the monumental offensive unfold, Churchill said to Eisenhower, "My dear General, the German is whipped. We've got him. He's all through." Indeed, enemy resistance proved surprisingly light in most areas. In the U.S. Ninth Army sector, where 2 divisions, about 34,000 men, crossed shoulder to shoulder with the British, there were only 31 casualties. Now Montgomery had more than 20 divisions and 1,500 tanks across the river and was driving for the Elbe. The road to Berlin, which Churchill had called the prime and true objective of the Anglo-American armies, seemed wide open. It was open politically too. There had never been any Big Three discussions about which army would take the city. Berlin was an open target, waiting to be captured by the Allied army that reached it first. However, there had been plenty of discussions regarding the occupation of the rest of the enemy nation, as indicated by the sectors laid out in the Operation Eclipse maps. Decisions regarding the occupation of Germany were to have a crucial effect on the capture and political future of Berlin. At least one of the Allied leaders had realized this from the start. "There will definitely be a race for Berlin," he had said. That man was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It had been 17 months earlier, on November 19, 1943, that the matter was brought before Roosevelt. On that occasion, the president had sat at the head of the table in a conference room of Admiral Ernest J. King's suite aboard the battleship USS Iowa. Flanking him were assistants and advisers, among them the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Roosevelt was en route to the Middle East for the Cairo and Tehran conferences, the 5th and 6th of the Allied leaders' wartime meetings. These were momentous days in the global struggle with the Axis powers. On the Russian front, the Germans had suffered their biggest and bloodiest defeat. Stalingrad, encircled and cut off for 23 days, had fallen, and more than 300,000 Germans had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. In the Pacific, where more than 1 million Americans were fighting, the Japanese were being forced back on every front. In the West, Rommel had been routed from North Africa. Italy, invaded from Africa via Sicily, had surrendered. The Germans were hanging on grimly to the northern part of the country. And now the Anglo-Americans were preparing plans for the coup de grâce, Operation Overlord, the all-out invasion of Europe. Aboard the Iowa, Roosevelt was showing sharp annoyance. The documents and maps before him were the essentials of a plan called Operation Rankin, Case C, one of many studies developed in connection with the forthcoming invasion. Rankin C considered the steps that should be taken if there was a sudden collapse or capitulation of the enemy. In that event, the plan suggested that the Reich and Berlin should be divided into sectors, with each of the big three occupying a zone. What troubled the president was the area that had been chosen for his country by the British planners. Rankine Sea had been created under peculiar and frustrating circumstances. The one man most directly affected by its provisions would be the Allied Supreme Commander in Europe, but this officer was still to be appointed. The difficult task of trying to plan ahead for the Supreme Commander, that is, to prepare both the cross-channel offensive, Operation Overlord, and a plan in the event Germany crumbled, Operation Rankine, had been given to Britain's Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan, known by the code name Cossack, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander designate. It was a staggering and thankless job. When he was named to the post, Morgan was told by Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, "Well, there it is. It won't work, of course, but you must bloody well make it." In preparing Rankine Sea, Morgan had to consider all sorts of imponderables. What would happen if the enemy capitulated so abruptly that the Allies were caught off balance, as they were in World War I by the unforeseen German surrender of November 1918? Whose troops would go where? What parts of Germany would be occupied by American, British, and Russian forces? Who would take Berlin? These were the basic questions, and they had to be solved in clear and decisive ways if the Allies were not to be surprised by a sudden collapse. Up to that time, no specific plan for the war's end had ever been set down. Although in the United States and Britain various governmental bodies discussed the problems that would arise on the cessation of hostilities, little headway was made in the formulation of an overall policy. There was agreement on only one point, that the enemy country would be occupied. The Russians, by contrast, had no difficulty arriving at a policy. Occupation had always been taken for granted by Joseph Stalin, and he had always known exactly how he would go about it. As far back as December 1941, he bluntly informed Britain's Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, of his post-war demands, naming the territories he intended to occupy and annex. It was an impressive list. Included in his victory booty, Stalin wanted recognition of his claims to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. That part of Finland which he had taken when he attacked the Finns in 1939, the province of Bessarabia in Romania, that part of eastern Poland which the Soviets had overrun in 1939 by agreement with the Nazis, and most of East Prussia. As he calmly laid down his terms, guns were firing only 15 miles from the Kremlin in the Moscow suburbs, where German forces were still fighting desperately. Although the British considered Stalin's 1941 demands premature to say the least, by 1943 they were preparing plans of their own. The British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, had recommended that Germany be totally occupied and divided among the Allies into 3 zones. A cabinet body called the Armistice and Post-War Committee was thereupon set up under Deputy Prime Minister Clement Attlee, head of the Labour Party. The Attlee Group issued a broad recommendation which also advocated a tripartite division, with Britain occupying the industry and commerce-rich northwestern areas. Berlin, it was suggested, should be jointly occupied by the 3 powers. The only ally with virtually no plans for a defeated Germany was the United States. The official US view was that post-war settlements should await a time nearer the final victory. Occupation policy, it was felt, was primarily a military concern. But now, with the collective strength of the Allies beginning to be felt on every front, and with the tempo of their offensives mounting, the need for coordinating political planning had become acute. In October 1943, at the Foreign Ministers' Conference in Moscow, the first tentative step was taken to define a common Allied post-war policy. The Allies accepted the idea of joint responsibility in the control and occupation of Germany and set up a tripartite body, the European Advisory Commission, EAC, to study and make recommendations to the 3 governments upon European questions connected with the termination of hostilities. But in the meantime, Morgan had produced his plan, a rough blueprint for the occupation of Germany, prepared, he later explained, only after a powerful amount of crystal ball gazing. Initially, without political guidance, Morgan had produced a plan calling for a limited occupation. but his final rank-in-C proposals reflected the Attlee Committee's more elaborate scheme. Morgan had sat down with a map and divided Germany into mathematical thirds, faintly sketching in blue pencil along the existing provincial boundaries. It was obvious that the Russians, driving from the east, must occupy an eastern sector. The division between the Anglo-Americans and the Russians in the revised rank-in-C plan was a suggested line running from Lübeck on the Baltic to Eisenach in central Germany, and from there to the Czech border. What the extent of the Soviet zone would be was of no concern to Morgan. He had not been asked to consider that, since it would naturally be the affair of the Russians, who were not included in our Cossack party. But Berlin did bother him, for it would lie within the Russian sector. Were we to continue to regard the place as a capital, or was there to be a capital at all? He wondered. The internationality of the operation suggested that occupation of Berlin or any other capital, were there to be one, should be an equal tripartite force by a division each of United States, British and Russian troops. As for the British and American zones, their north-south relationship seemed to Morgan to have been predetermined by one seemingly ridiculous but relevant fact: the location of the British and American bases and depots back in England. From the time the first American troops arrived in the United Kingdom, they had been quartered first in Northern Ireland and later in the south and southwest of England. British forces were situated in the north and southeast. Thus, the concentration of troops, their supplies and communications were separate, the Americans always on the right, the British on the left, facing the continent of Europe. As Morgan foresaw Overlord, this design was to continue across the Channel to the invasion beaches of Normandy, and, presumably through Europe, to the heart of Germany itself. The British were to enter northern Germany and liberate Holland, Denmark and Norway. On the right, the Americans, following their line of advance through France, Belgium and Luxembourg, would end up in the southern German provinces. "I do not believe," Morgan said later, "that anyone at the time could have realized the full and ultimate implications of the quartering decision, which in all probability was made by some minor official in the War Office, but from it flowed all the rest." Aboard the Iowa, the President of the United States realized the full and ultimate implications perfectly well. Those implications were precisely what he did not like about the rank-in-C plan. Immediately, when the afternoon session began at 3 p.m., Roosevelt launched into the subject and was plainly irritated. Commenting on the accompanying memorandum, in which the Chiefs of Staff asked for guidance on Morgan's revised plan, Roosevelt rebuked his military advisers for making certain suppositions, in particular that the US should accept the British proposal to occupy southern Germany. "I do not like that arrangement," declared the President. He wanted northwest Germany. He wanted access to the ports of Bremen and Hamburg, and also those of Norway and Denmark. Roosevelt was firm on something else: the extent of the US zone. "We should go as far as Berlin," he said. "The US should have Berlin." Then he added, "The Soviets can take the territory to the east." Roosevelt was also displeased by another aspect of rank-in-C. The US, in the south, would have a sphere of responsibility that included France, Belgium and Luxembourg. He was worried about France, and especially about the leader of the Free French forces, General Charles de Gaulle, whom he saw as a political headache. As forces advanced into that country, the President told his advisers, de Gaulle would be 1 mile behind the troops, ready to take over the government. Above all, Roosevelt feared that civil war might break out in France when the war ended. He did not want to be involved, he said, in reconstituting France. "France," declared the President, "is a British baby." And not only France. He felt that Britain should have the responsibility for Luxembourg and Belgium as well, and for the southern zone of Germany. As for the American zone, as the President visualized it, it would sweep across northern Germany, including Berlin, all the way to Stettin on the Oder. Then, once again, measuring his words, he emphasized his displeasure over proposed zonal arrangements. "The British plan for the US to have the southern zone," Roosevelt said, "and I do not like it." The President's suggestions startled his military advisers. 3 months before, at the Quebec Conference, The Joint Chiefs had approved the plan in principle. So had the combined American and British Chiefs of Staff. At that time, President Roosevelt expressed great interest in the division of Germany and added his weight to the urgency of the planning by expressing the desire that troops should be ready to get to Berlin as soon as the Russians. He Joint Chiefs had believed the issues involved in Rankin Sea were all settled. They had brought up the plan on the Iowa only because political and economic matters, as well as military policy, were involved. Now the President was challenging not only the occupation plan, but the very basis of Operation Overlord itself. If the projected zones of occupation were switched to accommodate the President's wishes, a troop changeover would have to be made in England before the invasion. This would delay, and might thus jeopardize, the cross-channel offensive, one of the most complicated operations ever undertaken in any war. It seemed clear to his military advisers that President Roosevelt either did not understand the immense logistical movements involved, or understood them perfectly well, and was simply prepared to pay a phenomenal cost in order to get the Northwest Zone and Berlin for the United States. In their view, the cost was prohibitive. General Marshall began diplomatically to elaborate on the situation. He agreed that the matter should be gone into, but he said the Rankin Sea proposals stemmed from prime military considerations. From a logistical standpoint, he reasoned, we must have U.S. forces on the right. The whole matter goes back to the question of the ports of England. Admiral Ernest King, U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, backed Marshall. The invasion plans were so far developed, he said, that it would be impractical to accept any change in the deployment of troops. The immensity of the problem was such that Marshall believed an entire new scheme would be needed just for the switching of troops, one flexible enough to be applied at any stage of development in order to get the President what he wanted in Germany. Roosevelt didn't think so. He felt that if there was a total collapse of Hitler's Reich, the US would have to get as many men as possible into Germany, and he suggested that some of them could be sent around Scotland, thereby entering Germany on the north. It was at this point that he expressed certainty that the Allies would race for Berlin. In that case, US divisions would have to get there as soon as possible. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's confidant and advisor, who was present on the Iowa, had the same sense of urgency. He thought that the US would have to be ready to put an airborne division into Berlin within 2 hours of the collapse. Again and again the President's military advisers tried to impress on him the seriousness of the problems that a change in Rankin Sea would entail. Roosevelt remained adamant. Finally, he pulled toward him a National Geographic map of Germany that lay on the table and began drawing. First, he drew a line across Germany's western frontier to Düsseldorf and south along the Rhine to Mainz. From there, with a broad stroke, he cut Germany in half along the 50th parallel roughly between Mainz on the west and Asch on the Czech border to the east. Then his pencil moved northeast to Stettin on the Oder. The Americans would have the area above the line, the British the sector below it. But as Roosevelt outlined it, the eastern boundary of the US and British zones would form a rough wedge. Its apex was at Leipzig. From there it ran northeast to Stettin and southeast to Asch. The President did not say so, but this shallow triangle was obviously to be the Soviet zone. It contained less than half of the area allotted to Russia in the Rankin Sea proposal. Nor was Berlin located within the territory he left to Russia. It lay on the boundary line between the Soviet and US zones. It was Marshall's understanding that the President intended Berlin to be jointly occupied by US, British and Soviet troops. The map showed unmistakably what the President had in mind. If the US took the southern zone proposed by Cossack in the Rankin paper, the President told his military chiefs, the British will undercut us in every move we make. It was quite evident, Roosevelt said, that British political considerations are in back of the proposals. The discussion ended without any clear-cut decision, but Roosevelt had left no doubt in the minds of his military chiefs as to what he expected. United States occupation, as envisaged by Roosevelt, meant the quartering of 1 million troops in Europe for at least 1 year, or maybe 2. His post-war plan was similar to the American approach to the war itself, an all-out effort, but with a minimum of time and involvement in European affairs. He foresaw a swift and successful thrust into the enemy's heartland, a railroad invasion of Germany with little or no fighting, that would carry US troops into the Northwest Zone and from there into Berlin. Above all, the President of the United States was determined to have Berlin. Thus was offered the first concrete US plan for Germany. There was just one trouble. Roosevelt, often criticized for acting as his own Secretary of State, had told no one his views except his military chiefs. They were to sit on the plan for almost 4 months. After the Iowa Conference, General Marshall gave the Roosevelt map, the one tangible evidence of administration thinking about the occupation of Germany, to Major General Thomas T. Handy, Chief of the War Department's Operations Division. When General Handy returned to Washington, the map was filed away in the archives of the Top Secret Operations Division. To the best of my knowledge, he was later to recall, we never received instructions to send it to anyone at the Department of State. The shelving of the Roosevelt plan by his own military advisers was just one of a series of strange and costly blunders and errors of judgment that occurred among American officials in the days following the Iowa meeting. They were to have a profound influence on the future of Germany and Berlin. On November 29th, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin met for the first time at the Tehran Conference. At this meeting, the Big Three named the representatives who would sit in London on the all-important European Advisory Commission, the body charged with drafting surrender terms for Germany, defining the zones of occupation, and formulating plans for Allied administration of the country. To the EAC, the British named a close friend of Anthony Eden, Under Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Sir William Strang. The Russians chose a hard-headed bargainer, already known for his obstinacy, Fedor T. Gusev, Soviet ambassador to the United Kingdom. Roosevelt appointed his envoy to the Court of St. James's, the dedicated but shy and often inarticulate John G. Wynant. Wynant was never briefed on his new job, nor was he told of the President's objectives in Germany. However, an opportunity soon arose for the ambassador to learn the nature of the policy he was supposed to espouse on the EAC, but the opportunity was lost. The Cairo Conference, Roosevelt, Churchill, Chiang Kai-shek, ran from November 22nd to 26. The Tehran meeting, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, began on November 28th and continued until December 1st. After Tehran, Roosevelt and Churchill met again at Cairo on December 4th. That night, at a long dinner meeting with Churchill, Eden, and the President's Chief of Staff, Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, Roosevelt once again voiced objections to the Rankin Sea proposals. He told the British, apparently without divulging the contents of his map or the extent of his revisions, that he felt the US should have the northwest zone of Germany. Churchill and Eden strongly opposed the suggestion, but the matter was passed on to the combined Chiefs of Staff for study. They, in turn, recommended that Cossack, General Morgan, should consider the possibility of revising the Rankin Sea plan. Wynant, although part of the delegation in Cairo, was not invited to the dinner meeting and apparently was never informed about the matters discussed there. As Roosevelt set out for home, Wynant flew back to London for the first meeting of the EAC, only vaguely aware of what the President and the administration really wanted. Ironically, only a few miles away from the US Embassy in London, at Norfolk House in St. James's Square, was a man who knew only too well what President Roosevelt wanted. Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, flabbergasted by his new orders to re-examine his Rankin Sea plan with a view to switching the British and US zones, put his hard-pressed staff to work immediately. He very quickly reached the conclusion that it was impossible, at least until after Germany was defeated. He so reported to his superiors, and that, he later recorded, ended the affair so far as he was concerned. Meanwhile, the US military chiefs, despite their protestations that they did not want to be involved in politics, were in fact left to decide US policy in post-war Europe. To them, the zoning and occupation of Germany were strictly military matters, to be handled by the Civil Affairs Division of the War Department. As an inevitable result, the War Department found itself at odds with the State Department over Germany. The consequence was a tug-of-war, in the course of which any hope of achieving a coherent, unified US policy on the subject was irretrievably lost. First, it was clear to all that something had to be done to direct Ambassador Wynant in his negotiations with the EAC in London. To coordinate the conflicting US views, a special group called the Working Security Committee was established in Washington early in December 1943, with representatives from the State, War, and Navy departments. The War Department representatives, officers from the Civil Affairs Division, actually refused at first to sit on the committee, or for that matter to recognize the need for a European Advisory Commission at all. The entire problem of the surrender and occupation of Germany, the army officers maintained, was purely a military matter that would be decided by military means. A special political organization like the EAC was unnecessary and even counterproductive. The State Department insisted on the need for a coordinated policy, but had neither the staff nor the means to formulate it. The committee struggled on, but by late 1943 it was already apparent that it was impossible to bridge the gap between the State and War Departments. One faction was ready to permit an occupation policy that was purely political, the other stood firmly on a military ground. A compromise seemed out of reach, and the American policy on post-war Germany remained in a state of utter confusion. Second, there were deeper issues involved that made the work of the Working Security Committee futile. The State Department was the principal agency responsible for the formulation of US post-war policy, but the responsibility for post-war planning was shared with the military. The two departments found themselves at odds over fundamental questions of policy, with the result that there was no unified view on the US occupation of Germany. This confusion, then, meant that there was no clear guidance for the US representatives in London, and the results were apparent in their lack of direction and decisiveness. Third, when the big conferences at Cairo, Tehran, and Yalta were over and the discussions were complete, the US representatives still had little to show for their efforts. They had accomplished almost nothing toward reaching an agreement on the occupation of Germany. The main reason was that the War Department and the State Department had not managed to reconcile their conflicting views and had left it up to the three principal Allied powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, to work out the details among themselves. The US diplomatic and military representatives were not given any clear guidance or specific instructions from Washington, nor were they informed about the full extent of the President's objectives. All they had was a general idea of US policy, an idea that proved inadequate and unsatisfactory for the critical task of negotiating an agreement on the future of Germany. And finally, the British believed that Russia, if not forestalled, might actually demand up to 50% of Germany because of her wartime sufferings. As far as the US was concerned, the die now seemed cast. Although the Big Three still had to approve the British plan, the hard fact for the US was that Britain and Russia were in agreement. In a way, it was a fait accompli, and there was little that Wynant could do except inform his government. The Soviets' quick acceptance of the British plan caught Washington and the President off balance. Roosevelt hurriedly dashed off a note to the State Department. "What are the zones in the British and Russian drafts, and what is the zone we are proposing?" he asked. "I must know this in order that it conform with what I decided on months ago." State Department officials were baffled, and for a very good reason. They did not know what decisions Roosevelt had made at Tehran and Cairo regarding the zones. There was a flurry of calls between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the State Department before the President got his information. Then, on February 21st, having seen the Anglo-Russian plan, Roosevelt reacted. "I disagree with the British proposal of the demarcation of boundaries," he bluntly stated in a formal memorandum to the State Department. He made no mention of the Soviet zone, but instead took sharp exception once again to the sector proposed for the US, repeating even more forcefully what he had told his military advisers on the Iowa. The President's memo was a revelation to the State Department. "Our principal object," he wrote, "is not to take part in the internal problems in southern Europe, but is rather to take part in eliminating Germany as a possible and probable cause of a Third World War. Various points have been raised about the difficulties of transferring our troops from a French front to a northern German front, what is called a leapfrog. These objections are specious, because no matter where British and American troops are on the day of Germany's surrender, it is physically easy for them to go anywhere, north, east or south. All things considered, and remembering that supplies come 3,500 miles or more by sea, the United States should use the ports of northern Germany, Hamburg and Bremen, and the Netherlands. Therefore, I think American policy should be to occupy northwestern Germany. If anything further is needed to justify this disagreement with the British, I can only add that political considerations in the United States make my decision conclusive. Then, to make absolutely sure that his Secretary of State really understood what he wanted, Roosevelt added, underlining the words, "You might speak to me about this if the above is not wholly clear." In a more jocular vein, he explained his position to Churchill. Please don't ask me to keep any American forces in France," he wrote the Prime Minister. "I just cannot do it. As I suggested before, I denounce in protest the paternity of Belgium, France and Italy. You really ought to bring up and discipline your own children. In view of the fact that they may be your bulwark in future days, you should at least pay for the schooling now." The U.S. Chiefs of Staff apparently heard from the President too. Almost immediately, the Army officers from the Civil Affairs Division reversed their position in the Working Security Committee. A few days after the London EAC meeting, a colonel strode into Professor Mosley's office in the State Department and spread a map before him. "That's what the President really wants," he said. Mosley looked at the map. He had no idea when or under what circumstances it had been prepared. He had never seen it before, nor had anyone else in the State Department. The map was the one President Roosevelt had marked aboard the Iowa. As mysteriously as it had emerged, the Roosevelt map thereupon again dropped out of sight. Mosley expected it to be brought up at the next meeting of the Washington Committee. It never was. "What happened to it, I do not know," Mosley said years later. "The next time we met, the Civil Affairs officers produced a brand new map, a variation which they explained was based on the President's instructions. Who received these instructions I was never able to discover." The new concept was somewhat similar to the President's Iowa map, but not quite. The U.S. zone still lay in the northwest, the British in the south, but the dividing line between them running along the 50th parallel now stopped short of the Czech border. Furthermore, the eastern boundary of the U.S. zone swung sharply due east above Leipzig to encompass even more territory. There was one other change, more important than all the others. The U.S. zone no longer included Berlin. In Roosevelt's original version, the eastern boundary of the U.S. zone had passed through the capital. Now that line swung west in a wavering semicircle around the city. Had Roosevelt, after insisting to his military chiefs that we should go as far as Berlin and that the U.S. should have Berlin, now changed his mind? The Civil Affairs officers did not say, but they demanded that the new proposal be immediately transmitted to London, where Wynant was to demand its acceptance by EAC. It was a preposterous proposal anyway, and the State Department knew it. Under the new plan, both Britain and Russia would get smaller occupation areas. It seemed hardly likely that they would accept such an arrangement after both had approved an earlier, more favourable division of territory. The Civil Affairs officers had produced the proposal without any accompanying memoranda to assist Wynant in rationalising it before the EAC. When asked to prepare such background papers, they refused and said that was the State Department's job. The proposal was finally submitted to Wynant without papers of any sort. The ambassador frantically cabled for more detailed instructions. When they were not forthcoming, he shelved the plan. It was never submitted. That was the last effort made to introduce a U.S. plan. Roosevelt continued to hold out against accepting the British scheme until late March 1944. At that time, George F. Kennan, Ambassador Wynant's political advisor, flew to Washington to explain to the President the problems that had arisen in the EAC because of the deadlock. Roosevelt reviewed the situation, and after examining the British proposal once again, told Kennan that considering everything, it is probably a fair decision. He then approved the Soviet zone and the overall plan, but with one proviso: the US, he insisted, must have the northwestern sector. According to the account that Kennan later gave Moseley, as the meeting broke up, Kennan asked the president what had happened to his own plan. Roosevelt laughed. "Oh," he said, "that was just an idea." All through the momentous months of 1944, as Anglo-American troops invaded the continent, routed the Germans out of France, and began driving for the Reich, the behind-the-scenes political battles went on. Roosevelt clung firmly to his demands for the northwest zone of Germany. Churchill just as tenaciously refused to budge from his position. In April, Wynant verbally informed the EAC of his government's position, but he did not immediately put the president's desires before the delegates in writing. The ambassador was not prepared to do so until he received instructions on one matter that he thought was crucial. In the British plan, there was still no provision for Western access to Berlin. The British foresaw no problem about access. They assumed that when hostilities ended, some form of German authority would sign the surrender and administer the country under the control of the Supreme Commander. No zone would be sealed off from any other, and, as Strang saw it, there would be some free movement of Germans from zone to zone, and from western zones to the capital, also freedom of movement for all proper purposes for Allied military and civilian staffs in Germany. Furthermore, whenever the subject had been mentioned in the EAC, Russia's Gusev had smoothly assured Strang and Wynant that he foresaw no difficulties. After all, as Gusev repeatedly put it, the mere presence of US and British forces in Berlin automatically carried with it rights of access. It was a matter that was taken for granted, a kind of gentleman's agreement. Nevertheless, Wynant thought the provision should be nailed down. He believed that corridors, such as those originally suggested by Moseley, had to be included before the Big Three formally accepted the British scheme. He intended to present such a proposal at the same time he formally placed the President's views on the zones before EAC. He wanted guarantees of specific rail, highway and air routes through the Soviet zone to Berlin. In May, the ambassador flew to Washington, saw the President, and then outlined his corridor provisions to the War Department. The Civil Affairs Division flatly turned down Wynant's plan. Its officers assured him that the question of access to Berlin was strictly a military matter anyway, and would be handled by local commanding officers through military channels when Germany was occupied. Wynant, defeated, returned to London. On June 1st, he formally agreed to the British plan and the proposed Soviet sector, with the one exception that the US should have the northwestern zone. The document contained no clause providing for access to Berlin. In tentative form, at least, the Allies had decided the future of the city. When the war ended, it would be a jointly occupied island, almost in the center of the Soviet zone. The power struggle now moved swiftly to its conclusion. In late July 1944, Gusev, eager to formalize Soviet gains in the EAC, deliberately brought matters to a head. Unless the Anglo-American dispute was settled so that the Big Three could sign the agreement, he said blandly, the USSR could see little reason for further EAC discussions. The implied threat to pull out of the Advisory Commission, thus nullifying the work of months, had the desired effect. On both sides of the Atlantic, anxious diplomats and military advisers urged their leaders to give in. Both Churchill and Roosevelt remained adamant. Roosevelt seemed to be the least flustered by the Soviet threat. Wynant was told that since the US had already agreed on the Soviet zone, the President could not understand why any further discussion with the Soviets is necessary at this time. But Roosevelt was now being pressed from all sides. While the political squabbles went on, the great Anglo-American armies were swarming toward Germany. In the middle of August, General Eisenhower cabled the combined chiefs of staff, warning that they might be faced with the occupation of Germany sooner than had been expected. Once again, the disposition of troops as originally foreseen by Morgan in his Rankin Sea Plan had returned to plague the planners. British troops on the left were heading for northern Germany, Americans on the right were advancing toward the south. Eisenhower now sought political guidance on the occupation zones. the first US military man to do so. "All we can do," he said, "is approach the problem on a purely military basis, and that would mean keeping the present deployment of our armies." Eisenhower added, "Unless we receive instructions to the contrary, we must assume this solution is acceptable, considering the situation which may confront us and the absence of basic decisions as to the zones of occupation." The crisis, long inevitable, had now been reached. The US War and State Departments, for once in complete agreement, were faced with a dilemma. No one was prepared to reopen the issue with the President again. In any case, the matter was due to be discussed at a new Roosevelt-Churchill meeting scheduled for the fall. Any final decision would have to be put off till then. In the meantime, Eisenhower's planning could not be delayed. Since the US chiefs had plans already prepared for a US occupation of either the northwest or southern zones, on August 18th they advised Eisenhower that they were in complete agreement with his solution. Thus, although Roosevelt had not yet announced his decision, the assumption that the US would occupy the southern zone was allowed to stand. Roosevelt and Churchill met once again in Quebec in September 1944. Roosevelt had changed visibly. The usually vital president looked frail and wan. The crippling polio, which his renowned charm and witty informality cloaked, was now evident in the painful hesitancy of his every move. But there was more than that. He had been in office since 1933, longer than any other US president, and even now was seeking a fourth term. The campaigning, the diplomacy at home and abroad, the strain of the heavy burdens of the war years were fast taking their toll. It was easy to see why his doctors, family and friends were begging him not to run again. To the British delegation at Quebec, Roosevelt appeared to be failing rapidly. Churchill's chief of staff, General Sir Hastings Ismay, was shocked by his appearance. 2 years before, he said, the president had been the picture of health and vitality, but now he had lost so much weight that he seemed to have shrunk. His coat sagged over his broad shoulders, and his collar looked several sizes too big. We knew the shadows were closing in. Tired, frustrated, trapped by circumstances and under pressure from his advisers and Churchill, the president finally gave in and accepted the southern zone. The British met him halfway. Among other concessions, they agreed to give the US control of the great harbours and staging areas of Bremen and Bremerhaven. The final wartime meeting of the Big Three occurred at Yalta in February 1945. It was a crucial conference. Victory lay ahead, but it was clear that the bonds binding the Allied leaders were weakening as political considerations replaced military realities. The Russians were becoming more demanding and arrogant with every mile they advanced into Central Europe. Churchill, long a foe of communism, was particularly concerned about the future of countries like Poland, which the Red Army had liberated and now controlled. Roosevelt, gaunt and much weaker than he had been at Quebec, still saw himself in the role of the great arbiter. In his view, a peaceful post-war world could be achieved only with the cooperation of Stalin. He had once expressed his policy toward the Red leader in these terms. "I think that if I give him everything I can and ask for nothing in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of democracy and peace." The president believed that the US could get along with Russia and that he could manage Stalin for, as he had once explained, on a man-to-man basis, Uncle Joe is get-at-able. Although the president was growing increasingly concerned about Soviet post-war intentions, he still seemed almost determinedly optimistic. At Yalta, the last great wartime decisions were made. Among them was one giving France full partnership in the occupation of Germany. The French zone of Germany and the French sector of Berlin were carved out of the British and US areas. Stalin, who was opposed to French participation, refused to contribute any part of the Russian zone. On February 11, 1945, the Big Three formally accepted their respective zones. Thus, after 16 months of confusion and squabbling, the US and Britain at last were in accord. The occupation plan, based on a scheme originally called Rankin C, but now known to the military as Operation Eclipse, contained one staggering omission. there was no provision whatever for Anglo-American access to Berlin. It took just 6 weeks for Stalin to violate the Yalta Agreement. Within 3 weeks of the conference, Russia had ousted the government of Soviet-occupied Romania. In an ultimatum to King Michael, the Reds bluntly ordered the appointment of Petru Groza, the Romanian communist chief, as prime minister. Poland was lost too. The promised free elections had not taken place. Contemptuously, Stalin seemed to have turned his back on the very heart of the Yalta Pact, which stated that the Allied powers would assist peoples liberated from the dominion of Nazi Germany and former Axis satellite states to create democratic institutions of their own choice. But Stalin saw to it that any Yalta provisions that favoured him, such as the division of Germany and Berlin, were carried out scrupulously. Roosevelt's desire to have Berlin for the United States was clearly evident from the lines he drew on the National Geographic map while en route to Tehran for the first Big Three conference. Military minds prevailed, and one of the plans that was substituted for FDR's was the one below. Notice that Berlin is no longer included in the projected American zone. In the end, after almost 2 years of discussions, the final occupation zones were chosen as shown on the back-end paper map. The typed inset is a note by Major General Handy. Roosevelt had been warned often of Stalin's ruthless territorial ambitions by his ambassador to Moscow, W. Averill Harriman, but now the Soviet leader's flagrant breach of faith came to him as a staggering shock. On the afternoon of Saturday, March 24th, in a small room on the top floor of the White House, Roosevelt had just finished lunch with Mrs. Anna Rosenberg, his personal representative charged with studying the problems of returning veterans, when a cable arrived from Harriman on the Polish situation. The president read the message and erupted in a violent display of anger, repeatedly pounding the arms of his wheelchair. As he banged the chair, Mrs. Rosenberg later recalled, he kept repeating, "Averill is right. We can't do business with Stalin. He has broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta." In London, Churchill was so disturbed by Stalin's departure from the spirit of Yalta that he told his secretary he feared the world might consider that Mr. Roosevelt and I have underwritten a fraudulent prospectus. On his return from Yalta, he had told the British people that Stalin and the Soviet leaders wish to live in honourable friendship and equality with the Western democracies. I feel their word is their bond. But on this same Saturday, March 24th, the worried Prime Minister remarked to his aide, "I hardly like dismembering Germany until my doubts about Russia's intentions have been cleared away." With Soviet moves becoming as plain as a pikestaff, Churchill felt that the Western Allies' most potent bargaining force would be the presence of Anglo-American troops deep inside Germany, so they could meet with the Russians as far to the east as possible. Thus, Field Marshal Montgomery's message announcing his intention of dashing for the Elbe and Berlin was heartening news indeed. To Churchill, the quick capture of Berlin now seemed vital, but despite the Montgomery message, no commander along the Western Front had as yet been ordered to take the city. That order could come from only one man, the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower. As originally conceived in 1943, there were actually 3 parts to Operation Rankin. Case A dealt with a situation in which the Germans might become so weak that only a miniature overlord invasion might be necessary. Case B conceived a strategic German withdrawal from some parts of the occupied countries, while still leaving the bulk of their forces along the European coastline to repel an invasion. And Case C dealt with a sudden German collapse either before, during, or after the actual invasion itself. Cases A and B were early abandoned and received, as Morgan recalls, only the briefest consideration. Stalin's proposals reached Churchill while he was crossing the Atlantic aboard the battleship HMS Duke of York en route to meet with Roosevelt. The US had just entered the war, and Churchill had qualms about raising the matter with his powerful new ally at this time. He wired Eden, "Naturally you will not be rough with Stalin. We are bound to US not to enter into secret and special pacts. To approach President Roosevelt with these proposals would be to court a blank refusal and might cause lasting trouble. Even to raise them informally would, in my opinion, be inexpedient. The State Department was informed of Eden's conversation with Stalin, but there is no evidence that anyone ever bothered to tell the President of the United States at the time. But by March of 1943, Roosevelt was fully apprised, and according to Eden, who discussed the matter with him, the President foresaw no great difficulties with the Soviet Union. The big question which rightly dominated Roosevelt's mind, said Eden, was whether it was possible to work with Russia now and after the war. The account of the events aboard the Iowa comes from handwritten minutes made by General George C. Marshall. The actual memorandum contains no direct quotes, only notes made as points of reference. I have directly quoted the President and others, where it was clearly indicated that a sentence was being attributed to them. The British have had a long economic affiliation with the Northern Zone, McCloy wrote General Marshall on December 12th, and Wynant tells me that the plan was brought out after consultation with their political and economic people. I do not know to what extent the President wishes to adhere to the occupation of these areas in the face of heavy English opposition. On the whole, I would favour the northern area, but I do not think it is worth the big fight. The State Department apparently did not care one way or the other. In his own handwriting, McCloy added that Cordell Hull had called and said he had no preference as between the northern and southern areas. One of the great myths that has developed since the end of World War II is that Roosevelt was responsible for the zones of occupation. The fact is that the plan was British throughout. It was conceived by Anthony Eden, developed by the Attlee Committee, which used Morgan's strictly military concept as the vehicle, approved by Churchill and his cabinet, and presented by Strang at the EAC. Many US and British accounts refer to the zonal division as a Russian plan. This erroneous conclusion derives from the fact that when Gusev, at the second meeting of the EAC, accepted the British proposal, he also submitted a Soviet draft covering surrender terms for Germany. One section dealt with the zones. It was the British plan in toto. What transpired between Roosevelt and Wynant at their meeting, or what the President's position was on the Berlin transit question, is not known. There is further confusion as to whether the War Department did or did not oppose Wynant's corridor plan. Major General John H. Hildring, Chief of the Civil Affairs Division, is reported to have told Wynant that access to Berlin should be provided for. The version here reflects the views of the three principal U.S. historians on this period: Professor Philip Mosley, The Kremlin and World Politics; Herbert Feiss, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin; and William M. Franklin, Director of the State Department's Historical Office, Zonal Boundaries and Access to Berlin, World Politics, October 1963. Wynant, Franklin writes, apparently made no memoranda of these conversations. This much, however, is clear. Wynant received neither instructions nor encouragement from anyone in Washington to take the matter up with the Russians. For reasons which would always remain obscure, Wynant's position on access to Berlin had changed after his return from Washington. Veteran diplomat Robert Murphy recalls that soon after joining Supreme Headquarters in September 1944, he lunched with Wynant in London and discussed the Berlin transit question. Murphy urged Wynant to reopen the matter. In his memoirs, Diplomat Among Warriors, he writes, Wynant argued that our right of free access to Berlin was implicit in our right to be there. The Russians were inclined to suspect our motives anyway, and if we insisted on this technicality, we would intensify their distrust. According to Murphy, Wynant was not willing to force the issue in the EAC. At the conference, another controversial issue boiled up when the President and the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, introduced a severe and far-reaching economic plan calling for Germany to be turned into an agricultural nation without industry. At first, Churchill subscribed to this scheme, but under pressure from his advisers, later retreated from his original position. Months later, Roosevelt abandoned the controversial Morgenthau plan. This incident comes from a private conversation with Mrs. Rosenberg, now Mrs. Paul Hoffman. Mrs. Roosevelt was also present. The two women later compared notes and agreed on the President's exact words. The raid took Berlin's defenders completely by surprise. Shortly before 11 a.m. on Wednesday, March 28th, the first planes appeared. Immediately, batteries all over the city crashed into action, belching shells into the sky. The racket of the guns, coupled with the belated wailing of air raid sirens, was ear-splitting. These planes were not American. US raids were almost predictable. They usually occurred at 9 a.m. and then again at midday. This attack was different. It came from the east, and both the timing and tactics were new. Screaming in at rooftop level, scores of Russian fighters emptied their guns into the streets. In Potsdamer Platz, people ran in all directions. Along the Kurfürstendamm, shoppers dived for doorways, ran for subway entrances, or headed for the protective ruins of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. But some Berliners, who had been standing for hours in long queues waiting to buy their weekly rations, refused to budge. In Wilmersdorf, 36-year-old nurse Charlotte Winkler was determined to get food for her two children, Eckhard, 6, and Barbara, 9 months old. In Adolf Hitler Platz, Gertrude Ketzler and Inga Röhrling, longtime friends, waited calmly with others before a grocery store. Some time ago, both had decided to commit suicide if the Russians ever reached Berlin, but they weren't thinking about that now. They intended to bake an Easter cake, and for days had been shopping and storing the items they would require. Over in Köpenick, plump 40-year-old Hannah Schulze was hoping to get some extra flour for a holiday marble cake. During the day's shopping, Hannah also hoped to find something else, a pair of suspenders for her husband, Robert. His last remaining pair was almost beyond saving. During air raids, Erna Sanger always worried about Papa, as she called her husband Konrad. He obstinately refused to go into a Zehlendorf shelter, and as usual he was out. Konrad was trudging toward his favourite restaurant, the Alte Krug, on Königin Luisa Strasse. No air raid yet had ever stopped the 78-year-old veteran from meeting with his World War I comrades every Wednesday. He wouldn't be stopped today either. One Berliner was actually enjoying every minute of the attack. Wearing an old army helmet, young Rudolf Reschke ran back and forth between the door of his Dahlem home and the centre of the street, deliberately taunting the low-flying planes. Each time Rudolf waved to the pilots. One of them, apparently seeing his antics, dived right for him. As Rudolf ran, a burst of fire ripped across the sidewalk behind him. It was just part of the game for Rudolf. As far as he was concerned, the war was the greatest thing that had ever happened in his 14 years of life. Wave after wave of planes hit the city. As fast as squadrons exhausted their ammunition, they peeled off to the east, to be replaced by others swarming in to the attack. The surprise Russian raid added a new dimension of terror to life in Berlin. Casualties were heavy. Many civilians were hit not by enemy bullets, but by the returning fire from the city's defenders. To get the low-flying planes in their sights, anti-aircraft crews had to depress their gun barrels almost to treetop level. As a result, the city was sprayed with red-hot shrapnel. The shell fragments came mainly from the 6 great flak towers that rose above the city at Humboldthain, Friedrichshain, and from the grounds of the Berlin Zoo. These massive bomb-proof forts had been built in 1941 to 42 after the first Allied attacks on the city. Each was huge, but the largest was the anti-aircraft complex built, incongruously, near the bird sanctuary in the zoo. It had twin towers. The smaller, called L Tower, was a communications control centre, bristling with radar antennae. Next to it, guns now erupting with flame, stood G Tower. G Tower was immense. It covered almost the area of a city block and stood 132 feet high, equivalent to a 13-story building. The reinforced concrete walls were more than 8 feet thick, and deep-cut apertures, shuttered by 3 to 4-inch steel plates, lined its sides. On the roof, a battery of 8 5-inch guns was firing continuously, and in each of the 4 turreted corners, multiple-barreled, quick-firing pom-pom cannons pumped shells into the sky. Inside the fort, the noise was almost intolerable. Added to the firing of the batteries was the constant rattling of automatic shell elevators, which carried ammunition in an endless stream from a ground-floor arsenal to each gun. G Tower was designed not only as a gun platform, but as a huge 5-story warehouse, hospital and air raid shelter. The top floor, directly underneath the batteries, housed the 100-man military garrison. Beneath that was a 95-bed Luftwaffe hospital, complete with X-ray rooms and 2 fully equipped operating theatres. It was staffed by 6 doctors, 20 nurses, and some 30 orderlies. The next floor down, the third, was a treasure trove. Its storerooms contained the prize exhibits of Berlin's top museums. Housed here were the famous Pergamon sculptures, parts of the huge sacrificial altar built by King Eumenes II of the Hellenes around 180 BC, various other Egyptian, Greek, and Roman antiquities, including statues, reliefs, vessels, and vases. The gold treasure of Priam, a huge collection of gold and silver bracelets, necklaces, earrings, amulets, ornaments, and jewels, excavated by the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in 1872 on the site of the ancient city of Troy. There were priceless Gobelin tapestries, a vast quantity of paintings, among them the fine portraits of the 19th-century German artist Wilhelm Leibl, and the enormous Kaiser Wilhelm coin collection. The 2 lower floors of the tower were mammoth air raid shelters, with large kitchens, food storerooms, and emergency quarters for the German broadcasting station Deutschlandsender. Entirely self-contained, G Tower had its own water and power, and easily accommodated 15,000 people during air raids. The complex was so well stocked with supplies and ammunition that the military garrison believed that, no matter what happened to the rest of Berlin, the Zoo Tower could hold out for a year if need be. As suddenly as it had begun, the raid was over. The guns atop G Tower stuttered to a stop. Here and there over Berlin, black smoke curled up from fires started by incendiary bullets. The raid had lasted slightly longer than 20 minutes. As quickly as they had emptied, the Berlin streets filled again. Outside the markets and shops, those who had left the queues now angrily tried to regain their former places from others who just as stubbornly refused to give them up. In the zoo itself, one man hurried outside as soon as the guns of G Tower stopped firing. Anxious as always after a raid, 63-year-old Heinrich Schwarz headed for the bird sanctuary, carrying with him a small pail of horse meat. "Abu! Abu!" he called. A strange clapping sound came from the edge of a pond. Then the weird-looking bird from the Nile, with the blue-grey plumage and the huge beak resembling an upended Dutch clog, stepped daintily out of the water on thin, stilt-like legs and came toward the man. Schwarz felt an immense relief. The rare Abu Markub stork was still safe. Even without the raids, the daily encounter with the bird was becoming more and more of an ordeal for Schwarz. He held out the horse meat. "I have to give you this," he said. "What can I do? I have no fish. Do you want it or not?" The bird closed its eyes. Schwarz sadly shook his head. The Abu Markub made the same refusal every day. If its stubbornness persisted, the stork would surely die. Yet there was nothing Schwarz could do. The last of the tinned tuna was gone, and fresh fish was nowhere to be found in Berlin, at least not for the Berlin Zoo. Of the birds still remaining, the Abu Markub was the real pet of head bird-keeper Schwarz. His other favourites had long since gone. Ara, the 75-year-old parrot which Schwarz had taught to say Papa, had been shipped to the Saar for safety 2 years ago. All the German Trappen ostriches had died from concussion or shock during the air raids. Only Abu was left, and he was slowly dying of starvation. Schwarz was desperate with worry. "He is getting thinner and thinner," he told his wife Anna. "His joints are beginning to swell. Yet each time I try to feed him, he looks at me as though to say, 'Surely you have made a mistake. This is not for me.'" Of the 14,000 animals, birds, reptiles and fish which had populated the zoo in 1939, there were now only 1,600 of all species left. In the 6 years of the war, the sprawling zoological gardens, which included an aquarium, insectarium, elephant and reptile houses, restaurants, movie theatres, ballrooms and administration buildings, had been hit by more than 100 high-explosive bombs. The worst raid had been in November 1943, when scores of animals had been killed. Soon after, many of those remaining had been evacuated to other zoos in Germany. Finding supplies for the remaining 1,600 animals and birds was becoming daily more difficult in food-rationed Berlin. The zoo's requirements, even for its reduced menagerie, were staggering. Not only large quantities of horse meat and fish, but 36 different kinds of other food, ranging from noodles, rice, and cracked wheat to canned fruit, marmalade, and ant larvae. There was plenty of hay, straw, clover, and raw vegetables, but nearly everything else had become almost unobtainable. Although ersatz food was being used, every bird or animal was on less than half rations, and looked it. Of the zoo's 9 elephants, only one now remained. Siam, his skin hanging in great grey folds, had become so bad-tempered that keepers were afraid to enter his cage. Rosa, the big hippo, was miserable, her skin dry and crusted, but her 2-year-old baby, Kanauchka, everybody's favourite, still maintained his youthful jauntiness. Pongo, the usually good-natured 530-pound gorilla, had lost more than 50 pounds and sat in his cage, sometimes motionless for hours, glowering morosely at everyone. The 5 lions, 2 of them cubs, the bears, zebras, hartebeests, monkeys, and the rare wild horses were all showing effects of diet deficiencies. There was a third threat to the existence of the zoo creatures. Every now and then, keeper Walter Wendt reported the disappearance of some of his rare cattle. There was only one possible conclusion. Some Berliners were stealing and slaughtering the animals to supplement their own meagre rations. Zoo director Lutz Heck was faced with a dilemma that not even the friendship of his hunting companion, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, or anyone else for that matter, could alleviate. In the event of a prolonged siege, the birds and animals would surely die from starvation. Worse, the dangerous animals, such as the zoo's remaining lions, tigers, and bears, might escape from their cages and become a threat to the city's inhabitants. To prevent this, Heck had ordered a number of the animals to be killed. This was an extreme measure, but he felt it was necessary. A special commission had been formed to carry out the task, and the heads of the zoo's big game and cat houses were given the grisly job of euthanizing the zoo's more dangerous inhabitants. It was done with the utmost secrecy. The zoo was to be closed to the public. One day in January 1944, Heinrich Schwarz received a call from the zoo director. "We have an urgent problem," said Lutz Heck. "It is very difficult to explain. Can you come over immediately?" Schwarz knew what was coming. For years he had been working in the zoo as a caretaker for the birds, and knew how desperate the situation had become. He also knew that the birds might be involved. He had been keeping watch over Abu Markub in particular, hoping against hope that the stork would survive. Heinrich Schwarz arrived at the zoo and was led to Lutz Heck's office. The director explained that the time had come to make a decision. "I have just received a telephone call from the Reichsmarschall," he said. "We have been told that a final decision has to be made. The endangered animals must be eliminated." Schwarz felt a sickening sensation. He knew that this meant the end for the remaining zoo animals. Lutz Heck was worried too. "The Reichsmarschall has made it clear that he wants a list of all the endangered animals that are to be put down," he said. "The list must be ready within 24 hours. That night, Schwarz walked the zoo grounds, searching for a quiet place to think. As he approached the bird sanctuary, he saw Abu Markub, his favourite stork, gazing wistfully out over the empty, war-ravaged gardens. The sanctuary was silent, except for the faint cries of the few remaining birds. The next day, Lutz Heck presented his list to the Reichsmarschall. Heinrich Schwarz had left the zoo without making a final decision. The list was delivered to the Reichsmarschall as requested. It was a list that included Abu Markub. Despite the intensity of the air raids and the proximity of the invading armies, the propaganda ministry had never suggested cutting short the Philharmonic's schedule. Concerts were scheduled at the rate of 3 or 4 a week, in between air raids, right through to the end of April, when the season would officially end. Any evacuation of the musicians before that time was out of the question. Goebbels undoubtedly would charge the musicians with desertion. Speer was determined to evacuate the orchestra to the west. He had absolutely no intention of allowing the men to fall into Russian hands. However, his scheme was entirely dependent on the speed of the Western Allies' advance. He was counting on the Anglo-Americans to beat the Russians to Berlin. Speer did not intend to wait until the Western Allies entered the city. As soon as they were close enough to be reached by an overnight bus trip, he would give the order to evacuate. The crux of the plan lay in the signal to leave. The musicians would all have to leave at once and after dark. That meant the flight must start right after the concert. To avoid a breach of security, word of the move would have to be withheld as long as possible. Speer had come up with an ingenious method of alerting the musicians. At the very last minute, the orchestra conductor would announce a change in the program, and the Philharmonic would then play a specific selection which Speer had chosen. That would be the musicians' cue. Immediately after the performance, they would board a convoy of buses waiting in the darkness outside Beethoven Hall. In von Westermann's possession was the music Speer had requested as the signal. When it was delivered by Speer's cultural affairs specialist, von Westermann had been unable to hide his surprise. He queried Speer's assistant. "Of course you are familiar with the music of the last scenes," he said. "You know they picture the death of the gods, the destruction of Valhalla, and the end of the world. Are you sure this is what the minister ordered?" There was no mistake. For the Berlin Philharmonic's last concert, Speer had requested music from Wagner's Die Götterdämmerung, The Twilight of the Gods. In this choice, if von Westermann had known it, lay a clue to Speer's final and most ambitious project. The Reichsminister, determined to save as much of Germany as he could, had decided that there was just one way to do it. For weeks now, perfectionist Albert Speer had been trying to find just the right way to murder Adolf Hitler. The Allied high commanders meet. Left to right, Marshal Sokolovsky, Robert Murphy, Field Marshal Montgomery, Marshal Zhukov, General Eisenhower, General Koenig of France. Lieutenant General William Simpson, Commander U.S. Ninth Army, talks with Field Marshal Montgomery. To the left of Montgomery, in the background, is General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group. Behind Montgomery is Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army. General Courtney Hodges, commander of the U.S. First Army. Lieutenant General Henry D. Crerar, commander of the Canadian First Army, with Montgomery. Major General James M. Gavin, right, the 38-year-old commander of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, ordered to drop on Berlin, discusses his plans with Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey of the British Second Army. General Jacob Devers, commander of the 6th Army Group. Major General Raymond S. McLean, 19th Corps commander, who expected to reach Berlin 6 days after crossing the Elbe. Major General Isaac D. White, 2nd Armoured Division. No damned infantry division is going to beat my outfit to the Elbe. Major General Robert C. Macon, Commander 83rd Infantry Division. The Ragtag Circus. Colonel Paul A. Disney, Commander 67th Armoured Regiment. What's the objective? Berlin! Major General Alexander R. Boiling, Commander 84th Infantry Division. Alex, keep going, and don't let anybody stop you. Brigadier General Sidney R. Hines, Commander of the 2nd's Combat Command B, receives the French Legion d'Honneur in March of 1945. We're on the Elbe. Major James Hollingsworth, 67th Armoured Regiment, receives the Silver Star from General Isaac White. He lined up 34 tanks and gave a command rarely heard in modern warfare. Charge! The Big Three at Tehran. Left, U.S. Ambassador John G. Wynant with Winston Churchill. Above, Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan, planner of Rankin Sea. It won't work, of course, but you must bloody well make it. Above, Ambassador to the USS R.W. Averell Harriman, who often warned the president of Stalin's ruthless territorial ambitions. Right, Fedor T. Gusev, Soviet ambassador to the United Kingdom. A hard bargainer, already known for his obstinacy. George F. Kennan, Ambassador Wynant's political advisor. Like Harriman, he warned again and again of his distrust of Soviet intentions. Professor Philip E. Moseley, acting chairman of the Working Security Committee, charged with working out American policy in post-war Europe in December 1943. He contended that provision had to be made for free and direct territorial access to Berlin from the west. Marshal Ivan S. Koniev, commander of the First Ukrainian Front at left, in 1945. Koniev with the author during a 4-hour discussion of his part in the capture of Berlin. This is one of the rare occasions on which he has permitted himself to be photographed. Marshal Konstantin K. Rokossovsky, commander of the Second Belarusian Front, at right, in 1945, with Montgomery. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, Koniev's rival, photographed in 1945. Marshal Vasily I Chuikov today. In 1945, he was a colonel general commanding the 8th Guards Army in the attack on Berlin. Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky with the author. In 1945, he was appointed deputy commander to Zhukov the day before the attack on Berlin. Lieutenant, now Colonel, Konstantin Y. Samsonov. In 1945, he was battalion commander of the 171st Rifle Division, which captured the Reichstag. Major General, now General, Ivan Yushchuk, commander of the 11th Tank Corps. The Americans and the Russians meet, April 1945. An American MP and a Russian military policewoman guard a bridge on the Elbe. American soldiers hold a makeshift flag made from a bedsheet painted with watercolours with which they identified themselves to the Russians. Second from the right is PFC, Paul Staub. American troops cross the Elbe to meet the Russians, waving, at right, in a captured Racing 8. Lieutenant Duane Francis, right, pilot of the unarmed Piper Cub scout plane Miss Me, stands beside his kill. RAF Warrant Officer James Dixie Deans, 5th from left, with left hand showing at waist and RAF pilot's wings, with German officers of Stalag 357. Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, Senior Medical Officer, British Second Army. No description could bring home the horrors I saw. All along the Eastern Front, the great Russian armies were massing, but they were still far from ready to open the Berlin offensive. The Soviet commanders chafed at the delay. The Oder was a formidable barrier, and the spring thaw late. The river was still partly covered with ice. Beyond it lay the German defences. The bunkers, minefields, anti-tank ditches and dug-in artillery positions. Each day now the Germans grew stronger, and this fact worried the Red Army generals. No one was more anxious to get started than the 45-year-old Colonel General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, commander of the crack 8th Guards Army, who had earned great renown in the Soviet Union as the defender of Stalingrad. Chuikov blamed the hold-up on the Western Allies. After the surprise German attack in the Ardennes in December, the British and Americans had asked Stalin to ease the pressure by speeding up the Red Army's drive from the east. Stalin had agreed and had launched the Russian offensive in Poland sooner than planned. Chuikov believed, as he was later to say, that if our lines of communications had not been so spread out and strained in the rear, we could have struck out for Berlin itself in February. But so fast was the Soviet advance out of Poland that when the armies reached the Oder, they found that they had outrun their supplies and communications. The offensive came to a halt because, as Chuikov put it, we needed ammunition, fuel and pontoons for forcing the Oder, the riverways and canals that lay in front of Berlin. The need to regroup and prepare had already given the Germans nearly 2 months in which to organize their defenses. Chuikov was bitter. Each day's wait meant more casualties for his guardsmen when the attack began. Colonel General Mikhail Yefimovich Katukov, commander of the 1st Guards Tank Army, was equally eager for the offensive to begin, yet he was grateful for the delay. His men needed the rest, and his maintenance crews needed a chance to repair the armoured vehicles. The tanks have travelled in a straight line, perhaps 570 kilometres, he had told one of his corps commanders, General Getman, after they reached the Oder. But, Andrea Levrentovich, he continued, their speedometers show more than 2,000. A man has no speedometer, and nobody knows what wear and tear has taken place there. Getman agreed. He had no doubt that the Germans would be crushed and Berlin captured, but he too was glad of the opportunity to reorganize. "The alphabet of war, Comrade General," he told Katukov, "says that victory is achieved not by taking towns, but by destroying the enemy. In 1812, Napoleon forgot that. He lost Moscow, and Napoleon was no mean leader of men." The attitude was much the same at other army headquarters all along the front. Everyone, though impatient of delay, was tirelessly taking advantage of the respite, for there were no illusions about the desperate battle that lay ahead. Marshals Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Koniev had received chilling reports of what they might encounter. Their intelligence estimates indicated that more than 1 million Germans manned the defences, and that up to 3 million civilians might help fight for Berlin. If the reports were true, the Red Army might be outnumbered more than 3 to 1. When would the attack take place? As yet, the marshals did not know. Zhukov's huge army group was scheduled to take the city, but that too could be changed. Just as Anglo-American armies on the Western Front waited for the word "go" from Eisenhower, the Red Army commanders waited on their supreme commander. What worried the marshals more than anything else was the speed of the Anglo-American drive from the Rhine. Each day now they were drawing closer to the Elbe and Berlin. If Moscow failed to order the offensive soon, the British and Americans might beat the Red Army into the city. So far the word "go" had not come down from Joseph Stalin. He almost seemed to be waiting himself. A great procession of army supply trucks rolled along the narrow, dusty main street of the French city. In endless lines, the convoys roared through, heading northeast on the long haul to the Rhine and the Western Front. No one was permitted to stop. MPs stood everywhere to keep the traffic flowing. To the drivers, there was no reason to stop anyway. This was just another sleepy French city with the usual cathedral, just another checkpoint on the high-speed Red Ball highway. They did not know that at this moment in the war, Reims was perhaps the most important city in Europe. For centuries, battles had raged about this strategic crossroad in northeast France. The Gothic cathedral, rising majestically from the city's centre, had endured countless bombardments, and again its fabric had been restored. On its site or within its sanctuary, every French monarch, from Clovis I in 496 to Louis XVI in 1774, had been crowned. In this war, mercifully, the city and its monument had been spared. Now, in the shadow of the great twin-spired cathedral, stood the headquarters of another great leader. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces was tucked away on a back street close to the railway station in a plain, modern 3-story building. The building was the Collège Moderne et Technique, a former technical school for boys. Box-like, its 4 sides surrounding an inner courtyard, the red brick school was originally designed to hold more than 1,500 students. Staff members called it the Little Red Schoolhouse. Perhaps due to Schaeff's requirements, the headquarters seemed small. It had almost doubled its strength since 1944, and now comprised nearly 1,200 officers and about 4,000 enlisted men. As a result, the college could accommodate only the Supreme Commander, his immediate general staff officers, and their departments. The remainder worked in other buildings throughout Reims. In the second-floor classroom that he used as an office, the general worked almost without pause all day. The room was small and Spartan. Blackout curtains hung by the 2 windows overlooking the street. There were a few easy chairs on the highly polished oak floor, but that was all. Eisenhower's desk, set in an alcove at one end of the room, was on a slightly raised platform, once used by the teacher. On the desk were a blue leather desk set, an intercom, leather-framed photos of his wife and son, and 2 black phones, one for regular use, the other a special instrument for scrambled calls to Washington and London. There were also several ashtrays, as the Supreme Commander was a chain smoker who consumed more than 60 cigarettes a day. Behind the desk stood the general's personal flag, and, in the opposite corner, Old Glory. The previous afternoon, Eisenhower had made a quick flight to Paris for a press conference. The big news was the victory on the Rhine. The Supreme Commander announced that the enemy's main defence in the west had been shattered. Although Eisenhower told reporters he did not want to write off the war for the Germans are going to stand and fight where they can, in his opinion, the Germans were a whipped enemy. Buried in the conference was a reference to Berlin. Someone asked who would reach the capital first, the Russians or us. Eisenhower answered that he thought mileage alone ought to make them do it, but he quickly added that he did not want to make any predictions. Although the Russians had a shorter race to run, they were faced with the bulk of the German forces. Eisenhower spent the night at the Hotel Raphael. Then, leaving Paris shortly after dawn, he flew back to Reims. At 7:45 a.m., he was in his office and conferring with his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith. Waiting for Eisenhower, in General Smith's blue leather snap-top folder, were a score of overnight cables that only the Supreme Commander could answer. They were labelled with the highest security tag, "For Eisenhower's eyes only." Among them was Montgomery's message, seeking approval for his dash to the Elbe and Berlin. But the most important cable was from Eisenhower's superior, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall. By coincidence, Marshall's and Montgomery's messages had arrived at Schaeff within 2 hours of each other the previous evening, and both were to have a major influence on Eisenhower. On this Wednesday, March 28th, they would act as catalysts in finally crystallizing for the Supreme Commander the strategy he would follow to the war's end. Months before, Eisenhower's mission as Supreme Commander had been spelled out by the combined Chiefs of Staff in one sentence: "You will enter the continent of Europe and, in conjunction with the other United Nations, undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces." He had carried out this directive brilliantly. By dint of personality, administrative ability, and tact, he had welded the soldiery of more than a dozen nations into the most awesome force in history. Few men could have achieved this while keeping animosities to such a minimum. Yet the 55-year-old Eisenhower did not conform to the traditional European concept of the military leader. Unlike British generals, he was not trained to consider political objectives as part of military strategy. Eisenhower, though a master diplomat in the politics of compromise and placation, was politically unaware in international terms, and proud of it. In the American military tradition, he had been schooled never to usurp civilian supremacy. In short, he was content to fight and win. Politics he left to the statesman. Even now, at this crucial turning point of the war, Eisenhower's objectives remained, as always, purely military. He had never been given a political directive regarding post-war Germany, nor did he regard that problem as his responsibility. "My job," he later said, "was to get the war over quickly, to destroy the German army as fast as we could." Eisenhower had every reason to be elated with the way the job was going. In 21 days, his armies had catapulted across the Rhine and burst into the German heartlands far ahead of schedule. Yet their headline-making advances, so eagerly followed by the free world, were now presenting the Supreme Commander with a series of complex command decisions. The unanticipated speed of the Anglo-American offensive had made obsolete some strategic moves planned months before. Eisenhower had to tailor his plans to meet the new situation. This meant changing and redefining the roles of some armies and their commanders, in particular Field Marshal Montgomery and his powerful 21st Army Group. Montgomery's latest message was a clarion call for action. The 58-year-old Field Marshal was not asking how the battle would be fought. He was demanding the right to lead the charge. Quicker than most commanders to realize the political implications of a military situation, Montgomery felt that the Allied capture of Berlin was vital, and he was convinced that it should be undertaken by the 21st Army Group. His cable, indicative as it was of Montgomery's intractability, made clear there were still vital differences of opinion between him and the Supreme Commander. Eisenhower's reaction to the Field Marshal's cable, as General Smith and others at Schaeff were to recall, was like that of a horse with a burr under his saddle. The crucial difference between the military philosophies of Montgomery and Eisenhower concerned the single thrust versus the broad front strategy. For months, Montgomery and his superior, Chief of the Imperial General Staff Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, had agitated for a lightning-like single thrust into the heart of Germany. Almost immediately after the fall of Paris, while the Germans were still disorganized and fleeing France, Montgomery had first put his plan up to Eisenhower. "We have now reached a stage," he wrote, "where one really powerful and full-blooded thrust toward Berlin is likely to get there, and thus end the German war." Montgomery spelled out his scheme in 9 terse paragraphs. He reasoned that the Anglo-American forces lacked the supply and maintenance capabilities for 2 side-by-side drives into Germany. In his view, there could be only one, his own, and it would need all the maintenance resources without qualification. Other operations would have to get along with whatever logistical support remained. "If," warned Montgomery, "we attempt a compromise solution and split our maintenance resources so that neither thrust is full-blooded, we will prolong the war. Time was of such vital importance that a decision is required at once." The plan was boldly imaginative and, from Montgomery's viewpoint, accurately timed. It also marked a strange reversal in the Field Marshal's usual approach to battle. As Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, now Eisenhower's Assistant Chief of Staff, later described the situation. "Put succinctly, Montgomery, principally celebrated hitherto for cautious deliberation, had conceived the notion that were he to be accorded every priority to the detriment of the American army groups, he could, in the shortest order, overwhelm the enemy, drive to Berlin, and bring the war to a speedy end." Obviously, the plan involved a gigantic gamble. To hurl 2 great army groups of more than 40 divisions northeast into Germany in a single massive thrust might invite speedy and decisive victory, but it might also result in total and perhaps irreversible disaster. To the Supreme Commander, the risks far outweighed any chance of success, and he had said as much in a tactful message to Montgomery. "While agreeing with your conception of a powerful thrust towards Berlin," Eisenhower said, "I do not agree that it should be initiated at this moment." He felt that it was essential first to open the ports of Le Havre and Antwerp, to sustain a powerful thrust deep into Germany. Further, Eisenhower said, "No reallocation of our present resources would be adequate to sustain a thrust to Berlin." The Supreme Commander's strategy was to advance into Germany on a broad front, cross the Rhine, and capture the great industrial valley of the Ruhr before driving for the capital. That exchange had taken place in the first week of September 1944. A week later, in a message to his 3 army group commanders, Montgomery, Bradley, and Devers, Eisenhower further elaborated on his plan. "Clearly Berlin is the main prize, and the prize in defence of which the enemy is likely to concentrate the bulk of his forces. There is no doubt whatsoever in my mind that we should concentrate all our energies and resources on a rapid thrust to Berlin. Our strategy, however, will have to be coordinated with that of the Russians, so we must also consider alternative objectives." The possible objectives, as Eisenhower saw them, varied widely. The northern German ports, they might have to be occupied as a flank protection to our thrust on Berlin. The important industrial and communication centres of Hanover, Brunswick, Leipzig, and Dresden. The Germans will probably hold them as intermediate positions covering Berlin. In southern Germany, the Nuremberg-Munich areas, which would have to be taken, to cut off enemy forces withdrawing from Italy and the Balkans. Thus, warned the Supreme Commander, we must be prepared for one or more of the following. A. To direct forces of both North and Central Army groups on Berlin astride the axes Ruhr-Hanover-Berlin or Frankfurt-Leipzig-Berlin, or both. B. Should the Russians beat us to Berlin, the northern group of armies would seize the Hanover area, and the Hamburg group of the Central Group would seize part or the whole of the area Leipzig-Dresden, depending on the progress of the Russian advance. C. In any event, the southern group of armies would seize Augsburg-Munich. The area Nuremberg-Regensburg would be seized by the central or southern groups, depending on the situation at the time. Eisenhower summarized his strategy in these words. Simply stated, It is my desire to move on Berlin by the most direct and expeditious route, with combined US-British forces supported by other available forces moving through key centres and occupying areas on the flanks, all in one coordinated, concerted operation. But, he added, all this would have to wait, for it was not possible at this stage to indicate the timing of these thrusts or their strengths. Whether the broad front strategy was right or wrong, Eisenhower was the supreme commander, and Montgomery had to take his orders. But he was bitterly disappointed. To the British people, he was the most popular soldier since Wellington, and to his troops, Monty was a legend in his own time. Many Britons considered him the most experienced field commander in the European theatre, as he was well aware, and the denial of his plan, which he believed could have ended the war within 3 months, left Montgomery deeply aggrieved. This strategic dispute in the autumn of 1944 had opened up a split between the two commanders that had never completely healed. In the 7 months since then, Eisenhower had not deviated from his concept of a broad, coordinated pattern of attack. Nor had Montgomery ceased to express his opinions on how, where, and by whom the war should be won. His own Chief of Staff, Major General Sir Francis de Guingand, later wrote, "Montgomery feels justified in bringing all influences to bear in order to win his point. In fact, the end justifies almost any means." One of the influences he brought to bear was powerful indeed. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Brooke, saw Eisenhower as vague and indecisive. He once summarized the Supreme Commander as a man with a most attractive personality and, at the same time, a very, very limited brain from a strategic point of view. Eisenhower was perfectly well aware of the biting comments that emanated out of the War Office and Montgomery's headquarters. But if this whispering campaign over his strategic policies hurt, Eisenhower did not reveal it, and he never hit back. Even when Brooke and Montgomery advocated the appointment of a land forces commander, a sort of field marshal sandwiched in between Eisenhower and his army groups, the Supreme Commander displayed no anger. Finally, after months of sitting with clenched teeth, to use General Omar Bradley's expression, Eisenhower lost his temper. The issue came to an explosive boil after the German attack through the Ardennes. Because the enemy drive split the Anglo-American front, Eisenhower was forced to place all troops on the northern salient under Montgomery's command. These forces included 2/3 of General Bradley's 12th Army Group, that is, the 1st and 9th U.S. armies. After the Germans had been thrown back, Montgomery gave an extraordinary press conference in which he implied that he had almost single-handedly rescued the Americans from disaster. He had neatly tidied up the front, the Field Marshal declared, and headed off, seen off, and written off the enemy. The battle has been most interesting, I think possibly one of the most tricky I have ever handled. He had, Montgomery said, employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. You thus have the picture of British troops fighting on both sides of the Americans who have suffered a hard blow. Montgomery had indeed mounted the main counter-offensive from the north and east, and had directed it superbly. But at the Field Marshal's press conference, to use Eisenhower's words, he unfortunately created the impression that he had moved in as the saviour of the Americans. Montgomery failed to mention the part played by Bradley, Patton, and the other American commanders, or that for every British soldier there were 30 to 40 Americans engaged in the fighting. Most important, he neglected to point out that for every British casualty, 40 to 60 Americans had fallen. German propagandists were quick to make matters worse. Enemy radio transmitters put out an exaggerated, distorted version of the conference and beamed the broadcasts directly toward the American lines. It was this version that gave many Americans their first news of the incident. On the heels of the press conference and the uproar it caused, the old controversy about a land forces commander flared again, this time supported by an active campaign in the British press. Bradley blew up. If the Field Marshal were appointed ground forces commander, he declared, he would resign his command. After what has happened, he told Eisenhower, if Montgomery is to be put in charge, you must send me home. This is one thing I cannot take. Patton told Bradley, I'll be quitting with you. Never had there been such a rift in the Anglo-American camp. As the Promote Montgomery campaign intensified, a campaign which seemed to some Americans to originate directly from Montgomery's headquarters, the Supreme Commander finally found the situation intolerable. He decided to end the bickering once and for all. He would fire Montgomery by making an issue of the whole matter before the combined Chiefs of Staff. At that point, Montgomery's Chief of Staff, General de Guingand, learned of the impending blow-up and hastened to the rescue of Anglo-American unity. He flew to Chafe and met with the Supreme Commander. He showed me a signal that he was about to send to Washington, de Guingand later recounted.